So the last major characteristic we're going to talk about this week, as far as solids and mass are concerned, is occlusion, the ability to block our sight, to obscure things that are behind it. So in Kyoto, Japan, there's a place called Ryoanji, which is roughly translated as Temple of the Dragon at Peace. And there's a Zen rock garden inside of the place, and across the Zen rock garden landscape are placed 15 stones like this. And as a result of their sort of careful arrangement, no matter where you stand, only 14 stones are ever visible at one time. You can never see the 15th. But according to tradition, only after attaining true enlightenment will you be able to see all 15 stones at once. Well, I guess either that, or if you manage to skydive in, see things from the air, you'd probably see it then. But as I mentioned earlier, when talking about mass and void, one of the major properties of mass is that it occludes, and in fact it cannot be really avoided in any sort of realistic scene. Any sort of figures you place in there will block other objects behind it. And that really causes any sort of space designer, any level designer, to carefully weigh what may or may not be seen at any one time. So imagine we've got a void with a couple of mass objects in it. Let's imagine this as sort of a top-down. Here I am, the hero player, as at the bottom. And we're looking at this mass, and though we may sort of infer the 3D shape of this opaque object based on our experience with objects that are similar to this, maybe this is a building, and we sort of understand that looking at a building, we understand that this side of the building will probably be mirrored on the other side of the building, but from any single perspective, we actually only see the surface of what's facing us, and the rest is sort of obscured. Sort of behind that, everything is a mystery. I mean, the object itself could be hollow. We can't see any objects that are back behind it. For all we know, the mass could essentially project infinitely in that direction. It could be something other than just a block, as you're seeing it here. But the kind of a curious peculiarity of mass is that it sort of projects sort of an occlusional shadow on the space behind it. Really, the only thing that we're actually seeing is this visible surface right here, and behind it is sort of this unknown. It could be really anything. So that's occlusion. So another characteristic of occlusion is the idea of overlap. So here we have a number of different shapes that sort of overlap one another, and essentially any opaque mass hides any spaces or figures that are sort of behind it in their vision, and sometimes that is even kind of a nuisance as a space designer when you're trying to communicate spatial relationships clearly to the player. But a lot of times occlusion actually has very practical reasons why we may want to use it sort of purposefully in our designs. And here's just a few of them. So imagine we have an object here, maybe it's a bit of a reward or something like that, and we want to hide this from the player so that they sort of discover it while exploring. So of course we can put an object in front of it that causes them to sort of look around the space before they come across it. They have to earn that reward. Another way that we can use occlusion is to entice the player to find those rewards. So in much the same way, we could use an object sort of in front of it, but by sort of having some objects sort of poke out on the left and right of it, or show sort of a partial amount of themselves that is apparent that it's a different object from the occlusionary object that's in the front, causes us to want to sort of explore around it and find what's on the other side, rather. Or it could be a case where we may want it to be harder for the player to accurately understand the structure of the space. So in this case right here, we've got a bit of a castle, and I could imagine maybe if I needed to get to the tower, if that's my goal, then it'd be pretty easy for me to go up these ramps here. We've got 3 ramps that lead me up to this this tower. But if we, as the designers, wanted to make this harder on the player, we could sort of occlude certain key aspects or shapes, or limit the viewing angle. And so that way we can sort of like blur the clarity of the overall form and cause the player to sort of require them to take a look at the form from different angles in order to piece together a full map of what the structure is. Another thing we can do with occlusion is to de-emphasize. So we could use occlusion to sort of cover up elements in the layout that may either confuse or compete with the visual elements that we may want to highlight. So in this case, we may want the player to focus sort of on a specific building, but there's a lot of buildings here. And so we can start bringing in objects that sort of cover up the silhouettes of other objects, other buildings, or bring in more foreground objects to sort of focus in and bring this building right here into prominence, because it's essentially the only building here that has a very recognizable sort of silhouette, or a complete silhouette, and that sort of stands out to us. Another way that de-emphasizing could also be used sort of in composition is that if we have sort of a this could be used sort of the opposite way, is that if we have some sort of singular element that is standing out way too much, we could use occlusionary objects to sort of de-emphasize it, to take some of that silhouette away. And we'll go a little bit more into that, I think, in next week when we talk about how to create readable shapes. Another thing that we do with overlapping objects is create a sense of depth in our layouts. So when forms sort of overlap in our visual field, we clearly perceive one object from another, and without that overlap, sort of that relationship and how far they are back from one another is sort of blurred. So sort of as we bring it together and we have these sort of objects sort of one after another, we can see very clearly which is behind another. And this brings us to sort of a last sort of technique that we use for with overlap, is that of emphasizing shape interaction. So in this case right here, we have a number of different sort of rectangles, and we've got this triangle that are all sort of different shapes, and we kind of by placing them over the top of one another as opposed to side by side, you can very, very clearly see the contrast and comparisons between the spaces, so, or between these objects. So a couple of weeks ago, at least from when I'm recording this, Nintendo gave a talk at CDEC 2017 about landscape design that they did for Zelda Breath of the Wild, and specifically talking about how they used triangles. And a lot of this sort of correlates to kind of what I've been talking about player path, about occlusion. So one thing that they noticed, and they hit home for all their environmental designers, was the tendency for triangles to sort of push the player to explore on the left or the right of it. And essentially you have these two these choices here. This triangle sort of splits your decision. Are you going to be heading to the left, the right, or are you going to take the difficult route to go over it? And so you have this sort of breaking up of intentionality of I guess the player direction, but that triangles also have this other characteristic of occlusion, which when you actually start moving past them, as it reveals that the objects that are behind it, it reveals it slowly. It reveals it just a little bit at a time. And so you sort of, over time, are sort of enticed more and more to reach whatever object is behind it. And this is in contrast to, say, a rectangular shape like this, which a rectangular shape very strongly emphasizes you must go left or right around it. And of course, in Zelda, you could climb up straight up walls, but they tend to be a lot harder. So it really kind of pushes you to, like, you're making a very strong choice here. And when you move past rectangular objects, they reveal background objects all at once. So a lot of times they would use rectangular objects more as occluders and full-time occluders instead of kind of as goals or as sort of guideposts like the triangles can do. So if we look at sort of an overall imagining of a space, we have triangles that are sort of set at three different distances from the player. They used triangles that are far away to be like distant goals. They used triangles sort of like in the mid-ground to act as occluders to, as you sort of go towards those distant goals, they sort of block what you are seeing in the immediate. And then they use triangles that are close by the player to sort of create some interesting path variance just in the short term. So if we go ahead and put some of our goals out here, and then let's bring in our rectangular shapes to sort of frame the setup and to occlude in an interesting way to promote exploration through this space.